So an agroecologist, a biological dairy farmer, and an agronomist walked into a field. And what do you think they saw? This was the question posed by John Morgan in 2011 for the Dominion Post when looking at what was happening with regenerative systems in New Zealand and the debate that was going on a decade ago. Neil Armitage was an extraordinary dairy farmer. In 1998, he cut out all of his potassium fertilizers and gradually began to reduce his inputs. He was doing that in response to animal health concerns, seeing more weed pressures coming into the system, and feeling like his system was no longer profitable. In 2006, he discovered the biological approach, and out of that, he saw dramatic increases in production, in animal health, and the reduction in weeds. The agronomist, when he looked at these fields, the perception he came to was that this farmer was mining his inputs, and he was a really good farmer. He was sure that the management here was good, but it was the fertilizer applied 13 years ago that explained the success of this producer. So Neil at the time was producing about 60% more than the New Zealand dairy farm average in milk production per cow. And as you can see in this image, I'm asking these questions of what do you see? Where's the curiosity? And what we find is when we change how we look at things, the things that we look at change. And this really is the regenerative approach. What is it that we're looking at and what's possible? Neil Armitage was using less than 6 units of nitrogen and running a very successful dairy farm business. So how is it that we can ask these questions in the New Zealand landscape? And what I find out here, and it doesn't matter where I am, is someone will say, well, it's all very well that they can do it in North America, or they can do it in Australia. They've got it easy. And, oh no, you can only do it on a small scale. These days, you'll find me in my happy place. I'm often found walking behind cattle with my horse and my dog. We're currently based in Montana and we work in the west of the United States. My company, Integrity Soils, is based in Australia, New Zealand, and North America. We work alongside producers that cover about 1.2 million acres. And then we also work with organizations in designing programs to improve soil health. And those programs cover around 24 million acres. So on average, I think our client size is about 10,000 acres. So for me, when I get asked that question, can we do it on a large scale? The answer is, oh yes, we can indeed. So at Integrity Soils, sometimes I feel like I'm this super generalist with a specialization in soils because we work with pretty much every single sector from cattle, bison, to apples, viticulture, large-scale cropping, turf industries, dairy farms, market gardens, you name it. If you've got soil, we've probably worked with your industry. The image here is of Alder Spring Ranch. They have 46,000 acres in central Idaho. They receive about 9 inches of annual precipitation. And as you can see on the ground there, this is tough country. So 24 million years ago, there were volcanoes all around this area. And what you're looking at is basically ash and tuff from that volcanic explosions. So lots of bare soil, lots of rocks. And what they're doing is they're replicating how the bison would have once moved through these landscapes. So there were never the huge herds that you sometimes hear about. There may have been mobs of like 400 or 500 bison that were moving through these landscapes. And as they moved, they didn't return to those areas for potentially a few years. So what's happening here is you have interns that have a GPS in their saddle, and they basically move like a flow with their cattle, and they never come back to the same area more than once in a year, and potentially up to once every 6 years. And so in this process, what they're doing is they're rejuvenating these landscapes. They're finding probably a 3-fold increase in ground cover. The species diversity has just exploded, and they've taken their soil organic matter from about 2% to 4.5% in that 6-year period, which is significant. So across 46,000 acres, we calculated on the back of a napkin that they're potentially sequestering the emissions of 18,000 Americans, or around 48,000 normal people in terms of our carbon footprint. So these people are doing extraordinary work. So it's possible in America, but what about New Zealand? This image here is from a station called Pegio. They're actually on the back end of Molesworth Station, so just inland from Ward in the South Island. This country here is some of their easy country. So incredibly steep, fairly challenging landscapes to work in. And when they came to me, the reason that they did is they were seeing very low lamb scanning. They were seeing photosensitivity in their livestock. They had an encroachment of what we call woody weeds, so matagari and bracken and those kinds of species. And also they were suffering from some pretty significant erosion, which they didn't feel that we could do anything about anyway. And this erosion was so bad that at times entire hillsides would come down and they'd have to get a loader in so they'd actually be able to leave their property. And that would happen at least once a year. So the area does get some significant rainfall. So what we did was we aerially flew in seawater, some biostimulants, and a little bit of trace elements and some sulfur to help address some of the what we're seeing in terms of trace element issues and microbiological issues. Within 6 months of that application, we saw a dramatic increase in the biomass of microbiology under the soil and the diversity of those microbes under the soil. So there was about 150 to 300% increase in those microbes. So it's all very well to build soil health, but what does that mean in terms of a result for a producer? So as you can see from the beginning of when those biological stimulants were applied, their scanning increased year on from that application. What was interesting is that the lambing in 2014 and 2015 actually dipped. And the reason for that is these guys are on that major fault line and are not that far from Kaikoura. So one of the unexpected outcomes from this was that the photosensitivity in the lambs went away and the erosion stopped. And when I mean erosion stopped, I mean it stopped. It stopped dead in its tracks. So we had fence posts to see and track that soil movement down hillsides, and those soils did not move after that application in 2012. Until, and you'll all remember this day, until this event happened. So 2016, these hillsides came down. Many of you will remember this image of the two Hereford cows and their calf on top of that wad of soil that came down. That was actually a neighboring property to the Peggio station, and that was the end of the ownership at Peggio. They decided to ditch all this work that they'd done on their land and then move away from that fault line. Some of the steps forward that we see with soils can be quite extraordinary as we begin to focus on soil health. And this is one of my favorite fence line images. It was taken by Kim Deans, who's a coach with Integrity Soils in Australia. They've been practicing regenerative agriculture for 14 years. They had a massive fire that came through in January 2019. And pretty much they were one of the few properties that really burnt because they had so much grass. Now, what's interesting is to see that recovery after fire, and we all saw these massive dust storms, and in fact, much of the dust that blew off Australia landed in New Zealand, or on top of New Zealand. And what you can see here is that the dust actually stops at the fence line, that all of that soil movement is happening in soils that are degraded. This idea that soils blow no matter what, it's not true. What we see with these big dust storms is a consequence of poor management of soil health. And that dust pretty much stops at the farm gate. And the reason for that is it's actually microbiology that emit like different types of poos and wheeze and mucus and spit and vomit and all that stuff to actually stick soil and hold a soil together. And then as part of holding that soil together, they're also creating these aggregations so that air and water can move through that soil. So when the rains did come and people were really excited, I was listening to the news while I was in Australia and people were like, great, our dams are filling up. That's not necessarily a good thing. So this image here shows you what happens when those heavy rainfalls arrived. It actually looks like the neighbor's place is a literal lake, even though it's on the same elevation, whereas the soil on this side of the fence is actually holding on to water and absorbing every drop. We've seen examples with regenerative operations where they are building soil health and focusing on microbiology across fence lines with nearly 30 degrees difference, Celsius, difference across that fence line just in that top centimeter. And you think about the stress of a plant when it's facing those kind of massive temperature fluctuations. So the temperature could actually change just with a cloud coming over. So you think of that stress for that plant. And that is all because of those airways and that airflow that we're creating. In 2006, this research was done on a regenerative apple orchard. So the regenerative's on the right and the conventional's on the left, same soil type. What you're looking at is basically an X-ray image of the pore spaces in those soils. So the dark is your soil and the light is all those air spaces. So through regenerative management practices and really focusing on building soil health, we have these systems that are able to function like a sponge, and they hold on to water and then release water as it's needed. The soils on the left are what we're seeing globally. So right now in New Zealand, they surveyed dairy farms in 2013 under a state of environment report, and they discovered that 78% of New Zealand dairy farms are significantly compacted. So that means even more compacted than this image. And across all of our pastoral land, about 44% of that is significantly compacted. What does that mean? That means that every time we have a heavy rainfall event, it's all just going to come rushing off the hills and on the lowland, and then end up having situations like Edgecombe, where we see massive amounts of flooding. We want to create soils that function like a sponge. And how is it that someone like Neil Armitage can actually reduce his nitrogen down to below 6 units? It's because soils, when they become compacted, need 10 times the amount of nitrogen and lose 10 times the amount of nitrogen, either to the atmosphere or into the waterways. So I find people get really, really excited about the opportunities offered by a soil health approach. And where do you start? And it can be some of the most confronting things is that very, very first step. And the first place to start is that curiosity and asking those why questions, like, how is it that a producer only needs less than 6 units of nitrogen? Or how is it that my neighbors have incredibly healthy animals and yet my animal health's not looking so good? Or why do New Zealand waterways look the way that they do? And what part might I play in that? So the second place to start is probably looking at what are some of the things that we can reduce that potentially may be very harmful. And then looking at what I call this the methadone program, but basically looking at how do we step out of one system without going through withdrawals. So that belief that if you're going to cut back your inputs and that's going to end up reducing your production and your profitability is true if you're not considering microbiology. So by working with microbiology, we can really build an ecosystem that functions well so that we don't end up with this basically withdrawal period. The third place to look at really is around diversity. So how do I increase the diversity, not only for my livestock, but it could be for my trees or vegetable production, and really thinking of they're providing multiple ecosystem services in terms of opening the soil up, of feeding microbiology, of feeding all of our, bees and beneficial insects, birds, whatever that looks like. Can you increase the species on the ground? And that might be in a cropping situation, maybe intercropping, having something that's coming through in the understory, having alley crops, growing cover crops at the end of the production cycle. In trees, can we have an understory mix that's incredibly diverse? And then thinking about incorporating more of our natives into this process. So are there trees perhaps that would go well with your ecosystem, but really focusing on biodiversity and capturing as much free sunlight energy as we can to pump that out through those root systems and really be feeding microbiology and building that matrix that allows all that air and water movement to happen and then allows those soils to stick together. So we can dramatically reduce the amount of soil losses in New Zealand by just starting to think about biodiversity and feeding microbiology in the process. The fourth place may be, in fact, to start talking to people that have been doing this in New Zealand for quite a while. There's certainly our coaching team, but there's people that have been doing this for many decades. So it's worthwhile talking to them or joining some of the groups that are around so you can share information and really feel confident before you start making large changes. And then that's really going to set you up for success. If you're wondering, how do we get microbiology back into the soil? In the New Zealand context, we find that actually there's a lot of microbiology in your system. They're not always awake. They're not always functional. But what we find is we can apply what we call the quorum signals or different types of biological metabolites to basically wake up these soil environments. We could be using things like compost extracts, fish products, seaweeds, all sorts of things that are very complex biological foods to basically wake up that biological component, and then that system starts to work. Now, if you do have something like compaction, we have a process that we call the 5 M's, which is looking at why is it that and we use it to look at every component on the farm. So why is it, let's say you have compaction? Well, is it a management issue? Is it your mindset? Is it a mineral imbalance? Is it a microbial balance? Or is it low organic matter, which is just cheating a little bit, but it's an M. And so by using those 5 M's, we can then diagnose what's causing that compaction so we can actually make a difference at the root of what's been causing that issue. And then if it is a mineral imbalance, maybe we can address it using minerals. Is it something with your management? You know, have you been overgrazing? Have you been cultivating? Have you been using a lot of synthetic fertilizers? They will all contribute to a compacted soil. So by then taking the actions to address that, we can start to see soils open up. And some of the quick ways to do that might be from your cover crops, or it might be perhaps using machinery to come through and open a soil up. And we're just going to do it once. And then we're going to address what's causing that compaction in the first place. And now that system starts to work. Even though personally, I'm no longer based in New Zealand, I still have some very favorite New Zealand clients. And one of them would be Riversun Nurseries. So they're based out of Gisborne. These guys produce between 3.5 to 5 million rootstock a year. And a huge focus for them is soil health. They have a 1,000-year sustainability vision. And every process that's now happening on this nursery, they ask the question of why? Why is it that we do these particular practices? So take, for example, one of the practices is they create furrows and then they lay black plastic. So you want to make sure the soil's a good consistency for rootstock. And then the black plastic means they protect it from weeds, and then it keeps it nice and clean. They then need to be able to put water underneath that black plastic so that they can irrigate. And then when it gets really hot on that black plastic, as you come into the middle of the season, they have to paint it white. So the question was asked of why do we do this? And at the end of the day, it was, okay, well, we're going to need to irrigate because we don't have water obviously entering that system, and we need weed control. So they began to ask the question of how could we do this in a way that reflects more how it works in nature. So they actually started to sterilize barley straw bales, and they ran those bales down between the rows. So no black plastics and no need for that, all of that waste. So you've got that waste plastic, and you've also got all that water system that becomes a waste product at the end of the year. What they found when they did the whole costing is even the labor units and having to roll that barley straw out, it was still cheaper to do that than to use the black plastic. And I know they keep expanding this in terms of, all right, what are some other options, but at least they're asking those questions. And it's very exciting for me to see large operations like that in New Zealand that are really serious about how do we do this? How can we have a 1,000-year sustainability vision? And the other thing that's really cool is they certify their rootstock based on mycorrhizal colonization. So they're educating vineyards themselves about the importance of this fungus that's so vital to the health of vineyards and so vital in the health of pasture systems. So the challenge of our generation is to answer that question of what is it that we see? Where is the curiosity in this world that we're currently living in terms of how do we build ecosystems that function? How do we build soils that can hold on to water, that can hold on to nutrients and don't rely on someone pouring stuff on? This is not a new approach in New Zealand, and it's certainly not possible just on a small scale. So I'd really like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Neil Armitage and to the thousands of farmers and growers and ranchers who are leading the way across the world. Thanks for tuning in.